Salam and welcome to the second round and series of debates hosted by Express TV and Tolo News. Afghanistan and Pakistan have been busy talking about terrorism, war, and politics pertaining to it. What we haven't concentrated on, discussed, is what matters to the people of both countries, which is job opportunities, trade, economic opportunities, and related matters. With that, I'll go to my colleague in Islamabad, Munizir. Welcome.
Good evening, Mr. Sultanzoy, and good evening, Kabul. Yes, it is time for both countries to move beyond war and animosity. But the big question is that can the two nations overcome their shortcomings, deal with the threat of terrorism, and move towards economic cooperation? At the moment, trade between Afghanistan and Pakistan is annually, formal trade between the two countries is $2.5 billion. In the years to come, can this multiply? And can both the generations of the two nations benefit from this? Can there be job opportunities being created on both sides of the divide? With that, I welcome here in the studio in Islamabad, Dr. Salman Shah. He was Pakistan's finance minister from 2004 to 2008 under the Musharraf-led government. He also served as an advisor to the former Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz on finance, economic affairs, statistics and revenues. He has taught at various universities around the world. Seated right next to him is Mr. Farhan Bukhari, who is one of Pakistan's best-known political and economic analysts, has worked for many local media outlets in Pakistan and is currently writing for the Financial Times. We also have here businessmen who have come especially for this show from Peshawar and representatives from the Ministry of Commerce, and with us, of course, students of politics and international affairs. It's over to you, Mr. Sultanzoy. Who do you have over there?
Thank you. We have a distinguished gathering here also. I would like to welcome Minister Anwar al-Haq al-Hadi, Minister of Commerce and Industry of Afghanistan, and Mr. Hamidullah Farooqi, former Minister of Transport and Aviation and a lecturer of economics in Kabul University. And our panel, distinguished audience here also are economists. We have businessmen of distinguished experience.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sultanzoy. The big question that everybody on this side of the border is asking is that with US troop pullout in 2014, it seems that the Americans will go away and there will not be much of a spending. There is a general perception that the Afghan kitty is too small and there will be a vacuum once the Americans leave. So there will be an economic crisis looming. What steps has your government taken to make sure that that does not happen? Because if that happens, sir, it won't be just Afghanistan that will suffer, it will also be Pakistan, because we may again face a refugee crisis like we did in the past. And I would like to put that question to Minister Ahadi, please.
Yes, Mr. Ahadi, you heard the question. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. And hello to Dr. Shah. I'm glad to see you from a distance. Let me address the question, and I'm not so pessimistic about the prospects for Afghan economy after the withdrawal of international forces. First of all, international forces, most probably there would be some forces left here, but even if we don't have international forces, the important thing is that under the Chicago Agreement, the international community will provide assistance of over $4 billion to support our security forces. And under the Tokyo Agreement, the international community will provide another $4 billion in assistance, in economic assistance. And most of that, probably about 50% of that support will be channeled through the budget. Currently, even though international support for Afghanistan is larger than $8 billion, but less than 20% is channeled through the budget. And money that goes through the national budget, its economic effectiveness is much larger than money that is spent directly by donors. Therefore, I do not expect any major gap in our economic output or the aggregate demand, and I think that we will be in a position to manage the economy with that sort of support. The growth rate might decline a little bit, so I'm not too pessimistic about the future of Afghan economy.
One thing that probably they would also like to know is, of course, these are good plans, but since we are mostly service industry in Afghanistan and consumerism, there will be an effect. What have you done concrete to make sure that the shocks are least?
Well, to the extent that the government can do something, for instance, the government is thinking of reducing our corporate tax rate. The government has proposed tax holidays for any investors who would invest in the next 2 years. The government has also decided to provide free industrial space to all those who would like to invest in Afghanistan in the next 2 years. I should also add that we are expecting a much larger revenue from our natural resources. So I think that I personally don't think that the shock will be as large as some analysts would anticipate.
Munira, back to you.
Well, Dr. Salman Shah, you heard what they said. They said $8 billion are coming directly into the budget, and they say there is going to be no vacuum. They are going to have tax holidays, free industrial space for investors, and revenue that they will generate from their natural resources. So, Mr. Hadi, they are looking very confident.
I think it's good to be confident and be optimistic, but the challenges are going to be a lot, and I wish them all the luck. If our relationship with Afghanistan becomes more interactive in terms of trade and in terms of investment, we can assist Afghanistan in many ways, even in their revenue generation, because a lot of their trade happens through Pakistan.
Right.
And we have always very supportive of Afghanistan in terms of collecting revenues from that trade. We have to take it step by step and make sure that the Afghan government has sufficient resources to be able to maintain the peace and security in Afghanistan as a first step. They need all the help they can get.
All right, they need all the help that they can get. I'll throw it back to you, Mr. Sultanzoy, before I come to my other panelist, Mr. Farhan Bukhari, so that we can speak to your other panelists before. It seems that in Pakistan there is a concern that for economic cooperation, economic prosperity, the prerequisite will be peace and security. And that really remains the concern of so many of our businessmen who are here, who say that in Afghanistan the infrastructure is weak, that there is no security, that there is looting on the way. So how do you address that problem?
Well, of course, we will talk about that when I get to the panel, but we have a question here. When Minister mentioned about cooperation and all the help we need, of course, 2014 being a worry for you also. You have been the recipient of a windfall from Afghanistan's construction and development, as our neighbors have been. But of course, Pakistan also holds another key post-2014, the void that is created. In terms of transit, you can play a major role. We've had a problem for many, many years, and you can make a huge difference in the economy of this country by not holding the transit routes hostage over Afghanistan's neck. And Afghanistan would like to see a better performance from Pakistan as a confidence-building measure. That would be this would be a good step. What can you say about that?
Well, thank you, Mr. Sultanzoy. I'll throw that question to Mr. Farhan Bukhari. They say that we are holding the transit routes hostage, that we can actually help them prosper, but we're not allowing them to do that. And in order for our viewers to understand what they're talking about, I think they're talking about the Pak-Afghan trade agreement, under which we do allow Indian products to come from Afghanistan, but we don't actually allow India to use our routes to take their products to Kabul.
I think that's part of a wider context here. Pakistan has had an adversarial relationship with India for a very long time. That's, in my opinion, now begun to change somewhat in the last year to 2 years. And as we move forward, open up liberalized trade with India, I'm sure a time will come when Pakistan's own concerns and grievances will be addressed. Pakistani officials I've heard complaining that while India demands free access through Pakistan to Afghanistan, would India allow similarly free access to Pakistani goods passing through India
right.
to Bangladesh and other countries?
Yeah.
So I think this is part of a wider problem as well as a bilateral problem. But in the very extreme, if people think that a Salalah type incident prompts or forces the Pakistani government to actually block trade with Afghanistan. That is something which in the very extreme can happen. And that is all the more reason why the political relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan has to evolve in a more positive direction, have inbuilt shock absorbers, so that if there are shocks, unexpected shocks in future, the confidence should be there large enough to absorb those shocks and move on.
All right, Mr. Sultanzoy, so you've heard Mr. Farhan Bukhari. The crux of the problem again is security, is again that we are two nations that are struggling terrorism, and we have been embroiled in kind of a tense environment. So until the tensions don't go away, how can you have a situation where you can have trade and economy and the two nations flourish?
Right. This would be a question like the chicken and egg, and I'll pass it on to Mr. Farooqi. Should security hold trade hostage?
And I believe I agree with him. We have facing to the security problem, but in many examples we can see economy and trade relation and economic prosperity could bring security and stability in the area and the region. And I think we shouldn't assume that we have to bring security first and then go for economic prosperity. What we have as a tool in our hand, SAARC, ECO, CARIC, and other region economic cooperation organization, which we counting on them. As exactly you mentioned before, unfortunately our trade and transit routes has been getting hostage in past at least 45, 50 years from our Pakistani colleagues and friends, and they were used as a political and military tool, and they were exactly using against our benefits and our social and economic well-being, directly and indirectly toward the Pakistani brothers and sisters there, because they also are suffering from the similar causes and similar situation.
Thank you. With that, I'll go to the audience.
Thank you very much. My name is Tamim Asi. I'm a university professor. Economic and trade environment in Afghanistan and Pakistan, more so in Pakistan, is dictated by military and security policies of both of the countries. I think if we get out of that, then we will realize the full potential of economic and trade in this region. To the Pakistan panel, how can we get out of this military lens that we see the economy and trade? Every time, if there is a trade issue, if there is a transit issue, there's always the military and the political environment affecting it. And we see that a lot of the logistics and transport companies are owned by the Pakistani military back in Pakistan. And we also see that we have issues with the cement industry. A lot of the cement industries in Pakistan are owned by the Pakistani military.
If I may return to the question that was posed earlier, and that is the link between security and the economy. Pakistan is our largest trade partner. Our exports to Pakistan is the largest market for our goods, even though the amount that we export is much smaller. In many ways, our economies are integrated. For instance, in the transportation sector, I think our economies, at least Afghanistan, is almost like Pakistani transport companies. Their activities are quite prominent in Afghanistan. I think in labor market, we have large number of Pakistanis working here, and there are Afghans who work in Pakistan.
So it's sort of a one-sided street. Almost.
I think there are quite a few Afghans who work in Pakistan as well. I think it's Afghan economy is more integrated into Pakistan than any other economy.
Afghanistan's biggest trade partner is Pakistan, but Afghanistan accuses us of viewing Afghanistan's economy with a military lens. I would ask my panelists to address that problem, but right after this short break.